known by his friends and coworkers as practical, responsible, and deeply committed to providing for his family. He was not at all considered impulsive or reckless, and people who knew him consistently described him as a careful man, especially when his children were involved. Ken had an older son, Donald, from a previous relationship who did not live full-time with the family and was not present on the day that they disappeared. And this will come back around later, so don't forget about that. Barbara Martin was a full-time homemaker and the emotional center of the household. She was closely involved in her daughter's daily lives and was regarded as a devoted and attentive mother. Friends remembered her as warm and protective, someone who took care and pride in maintaining a stable home. There was no known history of marital discord, financial crisis, or any kind of stability in the family for that matter, and nothing in her background would suggest a behavior that would put her children at risk either. Their three daughters, Barbara Jr., Virginia, and Susan, were all young at the time of the disappearance. They were all pretty much described as happy, energetic, and closely bonded with both parents. The family followed ordinary routines, celebrated holidays together, and actually had plans for the future that extended well beyond Christmas of 1958. Basically, the Martins were not a family on the margins or in crisis. They were deeply rooted in their everyday lives, which is part of what has made their disappearance so unsettling and deeply difficult to explain. At some point on Christmas Day of 1958, the Martins decided to take a short drive. The destination was never definitively confirmed, but the general understanding was that they planned to head east of Portland toward the Columbia River Gorge. It may have been as simple as some kind of scenic drive, or a trip to gather greenery, or to visit a specific lookout. This kind of outing was not unusual for the family, and certainly not for the people of Oregon either. The gorge is beautiful even in winter, and families often drive out simply to enjoy the landscape. Like I said, the Martins left their home in their station wagon sometime in the afternoon. The exact time is unknown. They did not pack any overnight bags. They did not notify anyone that they would be gone for an extended period of time. They did not cancel plans or suggest that they might not be back by the evening. Everything about the departure suggested a brief trip. When night fell and the Martins hadn't returned, concern was mild at first. It was Christmas after all, and any manner of delays could have occurred. But as the night passed and turned into the following day with no word from the family at all, alarm began to grow. By December 26th, relatives realized something was seriously wrong. Law enforcement was notified, and an official missing persons investigation began. Police started by reconstructing what little was known. They confirmed that the family had left the home on Christmas Day. They confirmed the likely direction of the travel toward the gorge, and they were confronted with a troubling reality. There were no confirmed sightings of the Martins after they left. No gas station attendants remembered them. No restaurant staff recalled serving them. No one had reported seeing a family matching their description stopped along the highway investigators to search roadsides, ravines, and any pull-offs along Highway 30 and other routes leading east from Portland. Aircrafts were also used when possible to scan for any kind of wreckage. Divers were dispatched to search areas of the Columbia River where a car might have reasonably entered the water by driving off. These searches were difficult, slow, and often dangerous. The river was cold, deep, and fast-moving. Visibility was poor, and the sheer size of the river meant that even a thorough search could miss critical evidence. Despite days of searching, nothing turned up. No debris from a crash, no oil slicks or floating wreckage in the river. And for investigators, this absence was troubling, but not necessarily decisive of anything. Cars had gone into the Columbia River before without leaving obvious traces, especially if they entered at a steep angle or in a remote location. As the search continued into January and February of 1959, the pressure mounted. The longer the family remained missing, the harder it became to maintain hope that they might still be alive. At the same time, the complete lack of physical evidence kept the case frustratingly open-ended. Investigators examined Ken Martin's financial records and personal life to see if there was anything suspicious, but they didn't find anything. There were no large withdrawals of money near the time of the disappearance, no signs of planning for any kind of escape, and no evidence of an affair or secret life. Barbara's background was similarly completely unremarkable. The family appeared stable, with no known enemies or conflicts that might lead to any kind of violence. These findings weakened theories involving voluntary disappearance or foul play driven by personal motives. Then, in May of 1959, the case took a devastating turn. Near the Dalles, I think that's how you pronounce it, far downstream from where the family was believed to have traveled, 3 bodies were discovered floating in the Columbia River. They were those of young girls. The recovery was slow and grim, and identification confirmed what investigators and relatives feared. They were the bodies of Barbara Jr., Virginia, and Susan Martin. The discovery of the children's bodies immediately reshaped the investigation. It confirmed that the river was central to what had occurred, and it also established that the children had died months earlier, likely around the time of their disappearance, though it was hard to figure out exactly when, especially since there was so much decomposition at this point. However, it of course raised new questions just as quickly as it answered old ones. Notably, the bodies of Ken and Barbara were not found. Neither was the station wagon. This asymmetry became one of the most perplexing elements of the case. If the family had gone into the river by accident together, why were only the children recovered? Why were they found together? Why hadn't the car resurfaced even partially? Investigators considered the mechanics of river drownings and vehicle submersions. It was possible, they reasoned, that the children's bodies had been ejected from the vehicle while the adults remained trapped inside the car. It was also possible that currents carried the bodies in different locations. However, it was still weird that all 3 of the daughters would be swept in one direction and then the parents would be swept in another. It was just strange. destination, investigators returned to an accident-based theory. One possibility was that the Martins' car slid off of a road near the river and plunged into the water. Another was that the family had stopped near the riverbank for some reason, maybe to just stretch their legs, and that an accident occurred while they were outside of their vehicle. In that scenario, the children might have fallen into the river first, with the parents attempting rescue and also drowning. However, this theory, of course, struggles to explain the missing car. A more controversial theory involved the possibility that Ken Martin intentionally drove into the river. This idea was not really based on evidence and more on attempts to account for the unusual aspects of the case. But of course, there was no history of depression, erratic behavior, or violence from Ken Martin, so it wasn't really a solid theory at all. Another lesser-known theory that has circulated over the years involves the Martins' older son, Donald, that I mentioned in the beginning. Like I said, Donald was Ken Martin's son from a previous relationship and was 28 at the time of the disappearances. Because he wasn't there and survived while the rest of his family did not, some investigators and later commentators have speculated about his possible involvement. The theory generally suggests that Donald may have had knowledge of the family's plans or movements that day because they just told him, and that there was some kind of family conflict that played a role in what happened. In more extreme versions of this theory, people speculate that he might have been involved either directly or indirectly, or that he knew more than he had disclosed. There's also something I forgot to mention here, that there was life insurance money on Ken and Barbara, that people thought that Donald had executed this whole plan to obtain that money, though it does seem like a weird way to go about it, and just seems too perfectly planned in my opinion. And also, in reality, investigators never found any direct evidence linking Donald to the disappearance. He was, of course, not with the family at the time. He had a strong alibi, and there was no indication of hostility. Those who knew the family described the relationship as generally normal. As a result, law enforcement did not pursue Donald as a actual suspect, and the theory remains speculative and largely driven by hindsight rather than proof. Also, one thing that people like to talk about also with this case was that Donald did come out as gay, and at the time in the 1950s that was not widely accepted at all, and apparently his dad took this quite hard when he came out when he was younger, so some people think there was animosity there as well, though again there is still no evidence linking Donald to the disappearance at all, and also he has an alibi. Of course, law enforcement also explored the possibility of foul play involving another person other than Donald. Could the Martins have encountered someone dangerous along their travels? Could there have been some kind of robbery or confrontation that escalated? Again, there was no evidence to support this, though. No stolen property was reported, no witnesses came forward, and no suspects emerged. The case ultimately stalled and grew cold, not because the investigators stopped caring, but because there was simply nothing left to pursue. Without a car, without the parents' bodies, and without new witnesses or evidence, every theory had just remained that, a theory. The disappearance of the Martin family remains unresolved to this day. What is known is heartbreakingly simple. A family would seem so cut and dry from the little girls' bodies being washed up, because you're like, oh, you know, there must have been some accident and they fell in the river. But then you think about how none of the vehicle parts were ever recovered, and that the parents' bodies were never recovered either. If the girls' bodies had floated up and became discovered, you would think that the parents' bodies would have as well. And of course, something that most of you probably are thinking is maybe the parents unfortunately killed their 3 little girls to start a new family somewhere else for some reason. But there's just no evidence for this. Both of the parents were regarded as great parents. There was just nothing to suggest that at all, and you would think that something would have cropped up by now if that was the case, in terms of either the vehicle or just the parents themselves. I mean, this was a huge case. Their faces were everywhere. I'm sure if they were seen, somebody would have reported it. But yeah, this case is just so strange, in so many ways. I would love to know what you guys think about this case, of course, as always. And also, as always, if there are any specific cases that you would like me to cover in the future, please comment them down below. I have a lot of cases on my list, but I will of course add ones that you guys want to hear. I do hope that you guys enjoyed this video.